السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على خير المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. It's really an honor and privilege for us to have Alexander Key with us, professor from Stanford, even though that we're here at Berkeley and this weekend is the big game. We have nothing to do with it, both himself or myself, at least for those who are following the competition, a football competition. At least we're being consistent at Berkeley, meaning losing, but that's on my own comments. Alexander is a scholar of classical Arabic literature whose interests range across the intellectual history of the Arabic and Persian-speaking worlds, from the 7th century onwards. Professor Key received his Ph.D. in Arabic and Islamic Studies from Harvard University's Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization in May 2012. And immediately thereafter started to work at Stanford University on the same year. He had authored a number of articles on aspects of classical Islamic Arabic literature and culture, and in his book, Language Between God and the Poets, he really have put some of his work in terms of the theory of 4 major 11th century scholars and asked how the conceptual vocabulary they shared enabled them to create theory in lexicography, theology, logic, and poetics. So this lecture today will focus about his book, Language Between God and the Poets. So would you please help me welcome Professor Alexander Key to Zaytuna College.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for your patience in waiting while I made the sort of mistake that people who've only just moved here make. I have no excuses. No excuses at all. Thank you to Hatem and Mohammed for organizing and for patience and for inviting me. So I'm going to talk today about the book that I just finished writing. I sent it off to the publishers on the 1st of November, so I'm still kind of reeling from not having it constantly in my every waking moment. It's going to come out in June next year, and it's going to be online open access. So there's going to be a free online version with University of California Press. The story of how the book came to be starts when I was at graduate school doing my Ph.D. and for those of you who've been through or are on the same journey, you know there's that moment where you start having to decide what you're actually going to write about, and you're looking for something that your advisor, thinks is a good idea, and you're looking for something that no one else has worked on. So I found a scholar, Raghib al-Isfahani, lives in Isfahan, dies around 409, 1018. And he was and the sources said that nobody had really worked on him, and he had a theory of reason and revelation. I thought this was very interesting. I thought I could write something about reason and revelation and the secular that would fit with my interests. But then when I started doing the dissertation work and I started reading all of Raghib's books in Arabic, I realized that reason and revelation was just something that he said at one point in his ethical work, and what was really interesting was the way he just kept coming back to language. Like over and over again, whenever he met a problem, whether it was a problem in exegesis of the Quran or a problem in describing the attributes of God, he would always come back to language, to this pairing of lafz and ma'na, this like the words and the ideas, the vocal forms and the mental content. So I wrote a dissertation about that, and I thought I'd put my finger on what Raghib's methodology was about. But he's just one scholar, and not a particularly well-known scholar, to be honest, which is why I picked him to write a Ph.D. dissertation. When you tell people you work on Raghib al-Isfahani, they tend to get him confused with one of the other much more famous Isfahanis, Abu Faraj being the main one. So I thought that what I wanted to do was test those theories, test that identification of a methodology on the big famous names that everyone knows, on Ibn Sina, on Abdul Qahir al-Jorjani, on Kalam, like as a whole, as a discipline in the 11th century. And that's really what this book is about. It's about seeing what the most influential scholars of the 11th century, people like Ibn Sina and Abdul Qahir al-Jorjani, who have this massive impact on the subsequent millennium of scholarship, seeing what their methodology was and what the real kind of nuts and bolts and intricacies of it was. One of the first things that happened when writing the book was a translation problem. So there's this word in Arabic which presumably most of you know. Most of you have seen this. And it's not always immediately clear how you should translate it or what exactly the authors are doing with it. And there's a particular sentence in Ibn Furak that was a translation problem that the book kind of came out of. So I'm just going to write that sentence up. It's quite short. ومعنى قولنا إنه عارض أنه معنى قائم بالجوهر. So I promise that's the last time I'm going to inflict my pained Arabic script on you. Or indeed the squeaking. ومعنى قولنا إنه عارض أنه معنى قائم بالجوهر. Now this is there's a whole lot of kalam going on here. This is Ibn Furak al-Isfahani in his Mujarrad Maqalat al-Ashari, and he's talking about the status of attributes, like attributes and qualities of things. He has a big discussion of the status of attributes and qualities of things. So red in a chair is a quality, it's an accidental quality. And one of the things that one of the targets of this discussion in Ilm al-Kalam is God's divine attributes. So you have a theory of redness in chairs and blackness in objects and speech in human beings that has to be consistent with the theory that you have of God's divine attributes and God's divine speech and God's various divine qualities. Existence, permanence. Now, what's interesting about this is the word ma'na appears twice. You might feel like you want to translate it as something like the meaning of our statement that this is an accidental quality is that it is a ma'na that subsists in the substance. So the ma'na of our sentence, that it's whatever it is, thinking redness you can fit in, or that it's an accidental quality, is that it's a ma'na qa'im bil jawhar. So the question is, how do you translate this? It seems to make sense that you would say the meaning of our statement that it's an accidental quality is that it's an essential attribute or a quality that subsists in a substance. But if you say that, so think of the blackness of the mic stand. So the meaning of our statement, the blackness of the nightstand is an accidental quality of the nightstand, is that the blackness is a M'ana that subsists in the substance of the mic stand. So this is like a theoretical discussion of what it is to be an accidental quality, like what it is to have blackness in a mic stand or redness in a cushion. But the translation problem is that if you use meaning at the beginning, you've translated the same word in two different ways in the same sentence. You've called it a meaning, and then you've called it some kind of accidental quality in English. And that seems to be problematic. Like, why would Ibn Furak, who was very careful with his terminology and very systematic and very rational and writes a very, the whole book is about what words are the right words to say and when it's the right time to say them and why they're rationally justifiable. It seems weird that he would use the same word twice with two different meanings that are basically incompatible with each other without noticing it. I mean, it seems like there's this thing called M'ana that's both the meaning of our speech and, at the same time, the quality of blackness in the mic stand or redness in the cushion on the pews. But it doesn't seem to make sense. Like, the blackness in the mic stand isn't a meaning. Like, the redness in the cushion isn't a meaning in the cushion. It's not like there's a meaning of redness in the cushion. So what exactly is going on? That's the translation problem that was at the heart of the project. And what I did was, first of all, I spent a lot of time going around in circles, reading the secondary literature, experimenting with different translations, not really being sure what Ibn Furak was saying. And then I decided that what you need to do in this kind of situation is have a picture of how language works. Any language, be it English or Arabic, be it modern standard Arabic or 11th century Arabic, that's going to inform the way that you deal with translation problems like this. And the idea about language that I found most useful was the work that Wittgenstein did in English, or rather in German, in the 20th century, where he said, look, the only way you can think about language is usage. Like, there's no set of meanings that you can point to. There's just the way people use words. Like, words don't have there's nothing in words apart from the way you use them. You can't say, oh, the meaning of this word is this, and the meaning of this word is this. Like, the meaning of the word cow is some idea of a cow, and then you have the word and the idea. He said that all that stuff is just philosophically confusing, and the only thing we can ever do is just talk about how we use the word cow. So you see someone pointing at a thing that moves, you know they're talking about cows. And if you take that approach to language, and you're trying to deal with a problem like this question, what it makes you do is say, okay, so Ibn Furak is using this word M'ana in this sentence twice. He doesn't seem to have a problem with it. He assumes that anyone who reads this sentence is not going to have a problem with it. Like, he doesn't think that he's being obscure or unclear. He thinks that if he says M'ana twice in the same sentence, you reading it are going to know what it means, and you're going to be able to understand the complicated theological point about accidental qualities that he's making. Because he's not making a point about M'ana here. He's just using the word to make a complicated theological point about God's divine attributes. So armed with that methodology, that the only thing we've got to go on here is the way he uses it, and he must have assumed it made sense. So we have to try and work out, like, from the way he uses it, what he means and what he was using it to do. then everyone else is using the word ma'na in the 11th century as well. Ibn Sina uses it, Abdul Qahir al-Jorjani uses it. It appears everywhere. It's in all the texts all the time. And no one ever stops to say, wait a minute, what does the word mean? Like, if you think about the way classical Arabic, classical Islamic scholarship works, the scholars always stop and think about word meanings. They always stop and they say, okay, but what exactly does this word mean? And they explain it, or they explain the options, or they say there's a disagreement about what this word means, and they explain it. You know, just like Raghib always did. But no one ever does that with ma'na. People just use it over and over again to do all these different things. No one ever stops and says, wait, you know, what's going on with ma'na? So that tells us the fact that they never stop to explain it, the fact that it's not like a methodological problem for them. That tells us that they must have all known what it meant. It can't have been a problem for them. The problem is just with us. Like, we're the ones that look at this sentence and can't comprehend how a meaning can be the same thing as a color. The other, and just to give you an example of one of the other ways that you might have seen the word ma'na pop up, is there's more than one famous exegesis of the Quran, the title of which is Ma'ani al-Quran. The first and the most famous one is Al-Farra. So the Ma'ani of the Quran that Al-Farra is writing his tafsir about, these are like the meanings of the Quran. Like, do we want to say that the meanings of the Quran, the Ma'ani of the Quran, and the ma'ani in objects, like blackness in the mic stand and redness in the cushion, and the ma'ani of our speech, ma'na qawlina, are all the same thing? Like that, again, that seems to cause us a problem in English. Like, it doesn't seem right that God's ma'ani, laid out in the Quran, revealed in exegesis by scholars like Al-Farra, ma'ani al-Quran, and, you know, ma'na al-aswad fil jawhar, or ma'na al-ahmar fil khaddi, or ma'na qawli wa ana atahaddath. It doesn't seem right that these could all be the same thing. So this is the translation problem. And basically I spend the whole book, you know, all 300 odd pages of it, trying to work through an answer to that translation problem, and then explain what my answer was. And I did that in four main chapters. A chapter on the lexicon, which is basically a chapter on lexicography, ilm al-lugha. A chapter on theology, ilm al-kalam. A chapter on logic, ilm al-mantiq. And a chapter on poetics, naqd al-shi'r. And basically 4 people. Raghib al-Isfahani for the lexicography, Ibn Furak al-Ash'ari al-Isfahani for the ilm al-kalam, Ibn Sina for the logic, and Abdul Qahir al-Jorjani for the poetry and the poetics. So what I found, or the argument that I put forward about the lexicon, is that it's the lexicon, like lexicography, the dictionaries, the work that the lexicographers do, Ahlul Lugha, starting with Al-Khalil ibn Ahmad and just going all the way through. Multiple people write dictionaries, people keep writing dictionaries, people keep referring to dictionaries. The dictionaries get bigger and bigger and bigger, you know, through Sihah al-Jawhari, and from Khalil ibn Ahmad through the Sihah al-Jawhari, all the way to Taj al-Urus, which is like, I don't know, here to the wall. This massive lexicographical project, which gets increasingly complex, and which you've probably encountered when you look up words in either an Arabic dictionary, or if you use Lane's lexicon, which is a reflection of that lexicographical project translated into English, you see how vast and complex this lexicographical project is, and how, it has a rigorous methodology. And also, if you think of the Oxford English Dictionary, think of when you look up a word in the OED and you get those instances of usage. Like, that only happened in the 20th century. And there's only one Oxford English Dictionary. But if you're in the world of classical Arabic scholarship and you're Ibn Forak writing in the late 900s, like late 300s, you've got like 200 years. You've got like 20 dictionaries to look at, and they're all bigger and more complicated and more epistemologically stable than the Oxford English Dictionary, like 1,000 years ago. So the lexicographical project has this tremendous weight in scholarly culture. And what the lexicographical project does is it establishes linkages between words and ideas, between alfaz and ma'ani. The lexicographical project is where everybody goes, be they theologians or scholars of politics or scholars of legal theory or Sufi, pick a discipline of classical Arabic scholarship, you will find them going back to the lexicon and then arguing about it, arguing about the status of the lexicon and arguing about which lexical meaning is the right meaning. But as an epistemological basis, like where do we go when we have a problem, the lexicon is absolutely unparalleled. It connects the alfaz and the ma'ani, the words and the ideas, and it also sets up this idea of Haqiqa. Because Haqiqa for the lexicographers is when there's a direct connection between one lafz and one ma'na that's got precedent. It's got lexical precedent. The phrase they usually use is Asalaamu. And basically this is a way of adjudicating lexical precedent for the scholarly community. So you're trying to deal with words, and you ask yourself, well, what's the original accurate connection between a certain word and the idea that it's talking about? And you establish that through the lexicon. So Haqiqa for the lexicographers is lexical accuracy. It's when there's a direct single line between a lafz and a ma'na. So it's important, moving on to theology, that stays important for theology. Because if a theologian is trying to determine, like Ibn Forak, he's trying to determine sort of rationally and also according to precedent what the appropriate words you can use to describe God are. So Ibn Forak is reworking what Al-Ash'ari said about this. So questions like, can you say that God is a thing? Shay. Well, some people think you can and some people think you can't. And one of the major places that you go to decide that is the lexicon. You ask yourself what the haqiqa of the word shay is, and then you decide whether that's theologically and rationally applicable to God. So lexicography feeds into theology. But then the other thing that you get in theology is you get the ma'ani, like the same ma'ani that you establish through lexical precedent. Ibn Forak uses this word ma'ana, like we can see here, to talk about both the stuff that happens in human heads in relationship to dictionaries, and to talk about God's divine attributes. So God's knowledge is a ma'na that is qa'im bidhat. And the ma'na of knowledge is related to the dictionary. So ma'na is this word for a concept that's stable. It's like a stable pigeonhole in the theologian's mind, in human minds. It's related to lexical precedent, and it's related to the divine truth, to the extent that humans can describe and talk about the divine truth. And the word haqiqa is this quality of accuracy that applies in both directions. So you have the ma'ani sitting in the theologian's head, and their haqiqa if they make an accurate connection to some extramental reality. So if you're talking about atoms, for example, as the theologians did, in the same way that now in the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, people are talking about atoms and the quality of atoms and how they interact with each other. And you get it right, like you make an accurate statement, you have an accurate understanding of what the atoms are doing, then it's haqiqa. And if you get an accurate, correct, like theologically and rationally correct description of God, it's haqiqa. And if you're using a word according to its lexical precedent, it's haqiqa. So the ma'ani stay the same as these stable pigeonholes, and haqiqa describes they're either accurately connected to God or accurately connected to the physical world or accurately connected back to the dictionary. One of the things that does, interestingly, is explain how so much of Islamic theology is about naming, which seems, from a sort of Anglophone perspective or a European perspective, to mean that they're just arguing about words. And then you find this in the scholarship. People say, Islamic theology, all they ever do is go on about words and naming. It's just semantics. But it looks like semantics from an Anglophone or European perspective. But if you're looking at it from Ibn Forat's perspective, it's not about semantics at all. Because you've got these mental contents, these stable pigeonholes that exist, and you're trying to accurately align them with the truth of God and with the history of lexical precedent. So naming is actually a very sort of tightly defined epistemological and ontological process. Now, it wouldn't have made sense to them to call it mere semantics. Like that's a European Anglophone problem. And it's not just the theologians. The theologians, the mutakallimun, are, popular and important, and they're also heavily criticized. Ibn Furak actually gets allegedly poisoned by Mahmud of Ghazni when he's on his way home after some theological dispute, because people are very impatient with these mutakallimun who are always, going on about fine epistemological distinctions and trying to describe God in exactly the right rational way. And there are plenty of people who are very impatient with that. And Ibn Sina is also not a fan of the mutakallimun from a different angle, because Ibn Sina sees himself as the heir of Aristotle. He's doing Aristotelian logic, he's following the truth of the Greeks, he has no real time for the Islamic theologians and their accurate descriptions of God. But Ibn Sina uses ma'na and haqiqa in exactly the same way. Ibn Sina's famous epistemological bedrock of tasawwur and tasdeeq, which you may have heard of, like the basic understanding of the way logic works is you have a tasawwur of something, you conceive of something, and then you decide whether it's true or not, according to a logical process. So first you have tasawwur, then you have tasdeeq. For Ibn Sina, you have tasawwur of a ma'na, a mental content, this stable pigeonhole, and then you do the logical decision of whether that ma'na is true or what that ma'na is doing with another ma'na. So ma'ani, again, just like in Ibn Furak, they're these stable categories in your mind. And haqiqa is what happens when they're right, when they're accurate. So Ibn Sina says, if you want to do logic, you have to have a haqiqa ma'na via tasawwur, and you have to have a... So if you want to say the red cushion is on the chair, you have to have an accurate conception of red and an accurate conception of cushion, and then you add the extra logical step of a ma'ana of on the chair, like whether it's actually on the chair or not. So the same conceptual vocabulary is used by Aristotelian logicians and the lexicographers and the theologians to do slightly different things, but it's exactly the same conceptual vocabulary. And then when you get to poetics, they're not trying to accurately describe God and God's qualities, and they're not trying to advance Aristotle's logic. People like Abdul Qadir al-Jorjani are trying to describe like what makes poetry beautiful. Like, why does a line of poetry make you feel like it's beautiful? Like, what is going on? Like, why do you think that some lines of poetry are better than other lines of poetry? Why are they ordered in that way? You know, why is the opening of Imr al-Qais's Mu'allaqa Qifa Nabki min Dhikra Habibin wa Manzili? Why is it that that particular word order has an emotional impact on you and other word orders don't? What al-Jorjani does with this exactly the same conceptual vocabulary, with the same conceptual vocabulary of ma'ana and haqiqa that you see in theology and logic and lexicography, is he notices that these stable pigeonholes, like these categories that you have in your head, the ma'ani, he recognizes that they're actually more like bundles. Each one of them is like a bundle of different ma'ani. So if you're comparing a brave person to a lion, the ma'ana of lion is actually a whole bundle of qualities. There's braveness in there, and there's, yellowness, and there's like having hair, and there's, having 4 legs and fierceness. So there's this whole bundle of qualities that make up a lion. And when you compare a brave person to a lion, you're kind of zeroing in on one of those qualities, the braveness. But you're not just zeroing in on the braveness. You're kind of zeroing in on the braveness while leaving the rest of the bundle there. And this is how he uses, again, the same concept of haqiqa. So what Jorjani noticed when he was trying to describe like how poetry worked is that, and this is a kind of a theory of metaphor that's incredibly influential for the next 1,000 years across all the works in the madrasa. And it's a theory of metaphor that stands up pretty well today against Western theories of metaphor. I mean, you read Lakoff and Turner, famous stuff on metaphor in the end of the 20th century. It's clear, and they're honest about it, that we don't really know how metaphor works. It's not like Western theory has nailed how metaphor works. And Jorjani's ideas about how it works are still very much salient. Because we still have, brains and words and poetry, just like he was dealing with brains and words and poetry. So the way Jorjani deals with comparison and metaphor is that he says, take that bundle of qualities of the lion, and when you compare a brave person to a lion, you say, Zayd is a lion is this classic example that he repeats over and over again. That bundle of mental qualities, that bundle of ma'ani, that's a lion, you're picking out the bravery, because the bravery is what you're interested in, because you want to say that Zayd is very brave, so you're comparing him to a lion. So you're picking out the quality of bravery. But then he says this, Jorjani says this very explicitly, he says, you have to have all the other qualities of the lion still there in your mind. Because otherwise you would just be saying Zayd is brave, and brave would be just a word. Lion would be just a word for brave. Like, that's not, metaphors don't work like that. It's not like we just change the meaning of the word lion to brave and we say Zayd is brave, Zayd is a lion. There's something happening. There's a bundle of lion mental quality, lion ma'ani. We're picking out the bravery whilst kind of keeping all the yellowness and the fierceness and what lions look like hanging there. And that's what that's what Jorjani calls Haqiqa. He says the Haqiqa of the lion, that whole collection of qualities that make up a lion, one of which is bravery, is still there even in the metaphor. And so even if you have like a really complicated poetic metaphor, you have something like, there's a line by Abu Tamam in where he talks about somebody who's noble, who he's praising. And he says he goes so high, it's as if he had work to do in the sky. And Jorjani notices that when you say that, these words are all still functioning with lexical accuracy. Because the word, when you say that someone is so high and so noble, it's like they're working in the sky. The working is still the same working that we do. It's the same lexical accurate working. It's still a literal account of the word working. And so is the sky. What's happened is that the poet has just pushed it all into a make-believe realm. So Jorjani identifies that what happens in poetry, like the reason we like these, the reason these metaphors and these images, like catalyze our imagination and make us enjoy the poetry, is this combination of haqiqa, so that the mental contents, the ma'ani in our head stay accurate, but they get pushed up into reality. So it's with poetics that same concept of haqiqa that was anchored in the lexicon for the lexicographers, that was the root of Ibn Sina's Aristotelian logic, that was the Ibn Forak's accurate connection between dictionaries and God and the extramental world. That same concept of haqiqa, what Jorjani shows us is that you can give it wings. It like flies up into the world of make-believe whilst still staying accurate. And that's what makes poetry so incredible, he thinks. So to conclude, and to come back to the translation problem, I was writing the book in English, and I couldn't use all the Arabic words that I've been using when talking about it now. Because with this audience, you can say, the ma'na of the haqiqa, of the connection to the tasawwur, of the, But if you write a whole sort of academic book, and it's this mix of Arabic and English, it kind of limits the audience. And I want to get these interesting ideas in Jorjani's poetics and Ibn Sina. I want to get this out to people who don't know Arabic. So it leaves you with this translation problem. Like, what do you do with sentences like this? Do you translate a single word in two different ways? And the theory that I found particularly useful was Thomas Kuhn, who's famous for writing about the structure of scientific revolutions. He has this book on the Copernican revolution. He also has this stuff on translation. He has this famous anecdote where he says, when he was a graduate student studying Aristotle, his teachers were telling him, Aristotle is like this, it's Aristotle. Read Aristotle's physics. So he starts reading Aristotle's physics, and he can't believe, how stupid it is. He's like, how can somebody this famous with this incredible reputation be writing this stuff? It doesn't make any sense. It's just silly. And then what he gradually realized was that Aristotle was just using the words in different ways. When Aristotle said nature, it just wasn't the nature that Kuhn was used to using in English as a scientist. And you have to kind of go back into Aristotle's world and work out what he's doing with the word nature and come to terms with it. It's like, and that's the problem that you get when you try and translate this, because you translate M'ana as meaning or as entitative attribute or something, and you miss out this backstory of what's happened to the word and where it came from and the use that I've been explaining people made of it in these different disciplines. It's like trying to understand Einstein's theory of relativity without knowing anything about Newton and gravity, is the example Kuhn uses. Like, you need to know that you can't just read Einstein from the get-go, because Einstein assumes that you know all about Newton. And it's the same here. Like, you see classical Arabic theory, rumbling along and producing all these ideas across logic and theology and legal theory and grammar and poetry and poetic criticism. And you have to kind of rewind and defamiliarize yourself and come to terms with the way that the words had these central concepts. Like M'ana just had different usages in the 11th century. The strategy I used in the book was to try to just every single time I came to M'ana to translate it as mental content, which produced some pretty ugly phrases. The mental content of our statement that it is an accidental quality is that it is a mental content that is subsisting in the substance. It's difficult and it's kind of clumsy, but the advantage is it makes you realize that this is a word that we don't have in English, and it makes you kind of get into their language game and start to work through it. And hopefully after like 300 odd pages of this, it's kind of entered your own vocabulary, and you're in the position that Kuhn eventually got to, reading and enjoying Aristotle's physics. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
If there are any questions, there we go. If there are any questions, please step forward. There's a microphone right up front to the left.
Good evening, nice to meet you, Professor Keys. My name is Abdullah Ali. I'm actually a assistant professor here at Zaytuna College. I teach Islamic law and prophetic tradition, but I also teach usul fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence. And as I was listening to the lecture, I had a number of observations naturally, but I guess a good way to begin is to say, before I actually ask my question, is that I can completely relate to the struggles of translation, being that, like yourself, I was an individual who at one time did not know Arabic. And when I studied Arabic, it was when there weren't many Arabic intensive programs around. So a lot of people like myself had to pretty much lock themselves in their rooms, marry the dictionary, and try to work through a lot of these type of problems. And so there's certain words which, perhaps, I don't know, I've looked them up perhaps 1,000 times, because they're constantly utilized in many different contexts. Among them are words like arada, right, the root of arid, qaddama, qama, so I don't know if you had that same experience. So I totally relate to that. But in light of my knowledge of usul fiqh, and which is very much centered around language, that for me, my understanding of the Arabic mindset in terms of why Arabs would not necessarily find this to be problematic, to find ma'na repeated twice, has very much to do with an understanding that most of the language actually is metaphorical. It's figurative, right? Like even Ibn Jinni actually was quoted as having saying, "Aktharu al-lughati al-majaz," that most of the language is majaz. Just for an example, like for instance, I'm looking at, when I'm looking here, I'm thinking of ma'na qawlina, both words themselves, right? For instance, ma'na itself for me, just simply an example of what we call itlaq ism makan ala al-maf'ul ism al-maf'ul, right? Just basically, so it's as if saying ma'niyu qawlina, but even the word qawl is majaz, because really it's maqul, ma'niyu maqulina. So qawl is a masdar, is a verb, is an infinitive or a verbal noun. And so the point, what I'm trying to point out here is that there's a concept in the language called ishtirak, right, where words have multiple meanings. Just as in English, we have homonyms, we have homophones, we have so many heteronyms, a lot of different types of words which take on multiple meanings. Now, what the original meaning may be, that is something different altogether. But I don't think the Irish Arab, at least during Raghib Asfahani's time, would have found that to be very, very problematic because of this general understanding that they had regarding this issue. Now, with regard to my question, it relates to what you had said about how perhaps, say, an Anglophone person would see this and how they may be a bit stricken or sort of troubled by what seems to be problematic or contradictory in some terms of using the same word to mean two different things or translating them in two different ways, and that Muslim theologians appearing to be focused only on words or designations themselves. In my opinion, and I'm wondering, I'm really asking the question whether or not if you would agree with this statement that rationality and language are inseparably connected. There's an inseparable connection between language and rationality. And that really is at the root, in my opinion, of a lot of these type of issues, and that, of course, naming is so you designate things are defined, right? Then you connect those words and those designations to other meanings. Right, so it's a very preliminary aspect to actual rationality itself, right? And so if you get into theology, you're seeking God, then at any rate, that's really the aspect of my question. I just wanted your thoughts about whether or not you felt there was an inseparable connection. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. No. Thanks. Yeah. That's. So one of the things that there's an irony to the way that I used Wittgenstein as a translation methodology to talk about classical Arabic, lexicography and language thought. And that's that Wittgenstein is absolutely certain that there's no such thing as homonymy or polysemy, and there can't be anything like ishtirak, lafz mushtarak, iddat ma'ani, beneath it, because that just doesn't exist. And yet, exactly as you said, that is exactly what all the classical Arabic scholars believe. When Raghib uses lafz and ma'na to deal with these problems, he does it by exactly this mechanism of ishtirak, the lafz al-mushtarak. He says, how does Raghib deal with the question of whether the Quran is created or not? Raghib says it's simple. There's a ma'na of Quran that is uncreated and stable, and then you have different instantiations of it in the mushaf and in the qira'ah and in the tilawah. So he explains everything by this process. And it gets sourced in the lexicon. When it comes to translation, though, what the best way to explain, so on the one hand there's that, but on the other hand, this is you never find people doing that with the word ma'na. People will take almost any word and show that it's a lafz mushtarak, and and this is fundamental to usul al-fiqh and is fundamental to so much of scholarship. But people don't do that with the word ma'na. They don't come across sentences and statements like this and say, ma'na is a lafz mushtarak, and here it means, the ma'na al-qawl, and here it means the ma'na of the jawhar. And that was what kind of pushed me into the process. And then on the English side, when we talk about homonymy and polysemy, I mean, it's not, I think it's important when you translate to understand that in every translation process, you have to have a theory of how language works in order to do the translation. Not just the Arabic language, but just language. Like, you need a theory of how English works in order to turn Arabic into English. And a lot of linguists don't think that homonymy and polysemy necessarily exist. Like, they're useful concepts to explain how certain things work in English, like bank, bank of a river, bank you put your money in. But whether they actually exist as aspects of linguistic fact, like in reality, the linguists themselves, people in linguistics departments, like not me, they don't all agree. Like, some people think homonymy exists, some people think it doesn't exist. They argue about it. So that's what pushed me to kind of, on the one hand, not use the lafz mushtarak to explain ma'na, because they don't, and on the other hand, not use the idea of homonymy to translate it, because I'm not absolutely sure that homonymy is a good model for English, even if you're not including Arabic. The question about rationality is also incredibly important. Like, you're absolutely right. Like, there's this default assumption that reason is operative, like throughout all these texts. All the logic, all the lexicography, pretty much all the theology, all the poetry. It's all understood as rational. Like, all these operations are rational operations. What's interesting is that we use this word rational, which is a useful word in English, and we all know what it means, and it's useful to apply it. But the construction of the concept of rationality in Anglophone and European thought is not quite what they assumed when they used the word aql, or ma'qul. Like, rational is a good translation for aql, and ma'qul, like, no reason, like, no question about it. It's a good translation. But they constructed rationality, I think, in a slightly different way. And what I'm trying to do in the book is show how they use language to construct rationality. Like, they had this concept of ma'ani as these stable bundles and these stable pigeonholes of cognitive process, and that's how they understood the operation of human reason. And that's just not shared in European and Anglophone philosophy. Like, the famous people who construct rationality in the Western history of thought don't think of language and rationality in the same way.
I pretty much enjoyed the lecture, but a few questions came up, and I wanted to ask you about those. So, the meaning being explained with the meaning itself left you lost. So I was wondering, to what extent you've examined whether there are other meanings for the second use of it. Like, the Washington Post has a tagline that says, if you don't get it, you don't get it. Meaning, if you don't get the newspaper, you don't get the meaning of the news itself. So this is sort of like that. And then you have other usage of words. Slight variations of those words explain the meaning itself. So there's a songwriter, her name is, American songwriter, her name is Cassandra Wilson, and she talks, I'll just say the line, she says, you don't know love until you know the meaning of the blues. All right, so this is, it seems like the manner in which these things are spoken may have a very different meaning, but my original question is, do you, in fact, have you come up with a meaning for the second use of the word?
So by the second use of the word, you mean the second line, basically? Yeah. I mean, I think what I've tried to do is not come up with a second meaning. Like, I don't think there is a second meaning. I think there's just one meaning, and it's a meaning we don't have in English, but it was a stable and uncontroversial meaning for them. The problem is exactly what you alluded to with the song reference and the Washington Post, and it's the problem with the word meaning in English. Like, it just doesn't quite map onto the word ma'ana in Arabic, in classical Arabic. I mean, modern standard Arabic is slightly different because there's like a feedback process. But classical Arabic just doesn't use ma'na in the same way as we use meaning in English. And the best example that I have for that is that, and in the book I'm much more careful than I was tonight. In the book I never use the word meaning, never, until like the last few paragraphs, because it gets in the way. It skews up the way we read the text, like, because we have this word meaning that's fundamental to the way we use the English language, and it messes up the way, the thought experiment of always trying to read ma'na in the same way. So the best example I have to make the meaning ma'na distinction clear is that in English we can say the meaning of life. And in Arabic, if you're in the 11th century, you can say ma'ana al-hayat, for sure. But it's just not the same. Like, when we say the meaning of life in English, we're talking about like personal destiny, we're talking about a journey, we're talking about like a sense of emotional centeredness, we're talking about cosmology, we're talking about religion. Yeah, the meaning of life is this big weighty phrase for us. It does a lot of work. But in 11th century Arabic, ma'na al-hayat is just what is the specific mental content found in the dictionary for the vocal form life. So ma'na al-hayat is just, okay, so let's go back to the asl al-lugha. Let's look up the word hayat. And let's say, okay, so it means this particular thing here, it means this particular thing here. So ma'na al-hayat is a statement about lexical meaning. And when you look up ma'na al-hayat in the lexicon, you find that sure enough, they use it to say things. Like Raghib has this discussion of, whether you can use the word hayat to talk about God. So it's not just purely dictionary meaning. You can then talk about, the sort of appropriateness of dictionary meanings for different people and different categories of existence. But that's a whole different kind of basket to meaning of life in English.
Hi. So if I kind of understood your lecture correctly, to just sum it up, what I got is that from your studies, you found kind of a discrepancy in translation between modern standard Arabic and poetry, and how people were using the language, and a indefinite spectrum that kind of gave poetry a certain level of freedom that Arabic, modern standard Arabic, didn't. And most of us, we always hear that to read the Quran, you have to read it in Arabic. And what I'm curious from your studies is, did you find a next level beyond the poetry to the Quran of even additional discrepancies that weren't present in the poetry but are very prevalent in the Quran of meaning and understanding?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think I would answer it by talking about the two different approaches to the Quran that you find in the classical scholarship, both of which use ma'na. So the first one is that what I mentioned before, where I don't want to say everybody, but a vast majority of exegetes, a vast majority of the mufassirin understand the process of understanding the Quran as being one of working out what the ma'na is and then saying it back in different alfaz. This is, so Muqatil's tafsir was one of the very earliest ones. He'll give a Quranic verse or a snatch of a verse or a few words, and then he'll say ma'anahu, and then he'll rephrase it. The same with a Farat. Farat has this, and then Farat gets a little bit more technical. He says things like, he's talking about why you don't write the alif in the basmala. And he says, because there's a ma'ana to the alif, and this is one of the ma'ani that native speakers of Arabic know is there, even when it's not written. Interestingly, that same hermeneutical process is also used with the word majaz, which came up in the first question. Abu Ubaida's famous tafsir, Majaz al-Quran, does exactly the same thing with the word majaz. He gives you a verse and then he says majazuhu, and he rephrases it. So that's one way of dealing with a very mechanical, practical way, which is exactly what you weren't asking about. And then the other way is the way Abdul Qahir al-Jorjani deals with the Quran, which is in terms of i'jaz. So you have this principle and this belief that the Quran is more beautiful than other language. And then your job as a literary critic is to explain how it's more beautiful and to lay out the structures that enable you to say that the ma'ani of the Quran are having more impact on you because of the way the Quran is written. And Jorjani's theory boils down to it's a matter of syntax. It's a matter of word order and the complexity of the word order. And it's the same mechanism in the Quran as it is in poetry. It's the beauty of the syntax and the complexity of the syntax is what sort of fires up and catalyzes the ma'ani in your head and gives you this extra impact that's Quranic inimitability.
Thank you for your informative lecture. There is a verse in the Quran that uses two words, an-nas, people. And I was wondering, how would you go about translating it? Because the first instance of people refers to one person, the second instance to a specific group. So it says, الَّذِينَ قَالَ لَهُمُ النَّاسُ إِنَّ النَّاسَ قَدْ جَمَعُوا لَكُمْ فَاخْشَوْهُمْ. So, just because when translating the Quran, if you go literal, or if you try to expand the word, then probably get something longer. I mean, how would you go about translating something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this principle that that you can't. I mean, there's the Richard Frank, who did a lot of work on the word ma'ana, said that it's this matter of, can you have two lexemes that mean two different things in the same sentence, like nes and nes, or like ma'ana and ma'ana here. And I don't think that the principle that governs the way I read ma'ana is applicable to all words. There's no question that human language, be it English or Arabic, be it the Quran or me talking about, I saw a bear in the headlights and I decided to bear left and I left the road. So I used bear twice and left twice, and they meant two different things. And it was reasonably understandable in English. And there's no question that the Quran can do exactly the same thing. You can use the same lafz, with two different ma'ani. And indeed, like, that's exactly how the exegetical tradition, approaches questions like that. What I think is different about ma'ana is that it's not a noun like people or bear or left, or left is a verb, participle, but it's what Kuhn calls core conceptual vocabulary. It's like a term that appears over and over and over again in this tightly connected, like, pairing with lafz, usually, and often, like, in the context of haqiqa. So not the whole of the language isn't like this. Like, lafz and ma'na and haqiqa are these little kind of team of, like, incredibly central words that get used over and over and over again in these stable ways, in a particular way in Arabic, that's not replicable by the way we use other little combinations, like the way we use meaning and idea and word in English. Again, that's like core conceptual vocabulary, or the way people like Einstein use gravity. It's like or the way Aristotle used the word nature. Like, there are these certain clusters of conceptual vocabulary that are incredibly central to the way people think about sort of knowledge and reality in any language or culture, and ma'na is one of them. And that's why it's so important, because it then shapes the way that other words behave. So you read it, and the way you read it affects the way you read the words around it, because it's kind of that central to the vocabulary. And that's why it's so important to always translate it in the same way, because it's a stable usage. And if you don't, it kind of gets lost, and its centrality and its stability gets lost. And that's just not the case with a word like bear or a word like ness. Like, there's lots of language that does function in exactly the way you described. That's not like core conceptual vocabulary.
Yeah. Yes, that was great. Say, I think I could take a question from online. And the question is, what is the relationship between the words and their meaning versus God and his attributes?
I mean, for Ibn Furak, it's really complicated and circular, because, like, this is why the question of divine attributes for the Ash'aris is so circular and so hard to describe in English. Because if you think about it, God exists and God is knowing. Like, God has to be knowing. Like, it's inconceivable that God would be not knowing or ignorant or anything like that. So God exists, and it's inconceivable that God wouldn't exist. So God exists, and God is knowing, as rationally. And then God also spoke and used the word knowing to describe himself in the Quran. So that's like another level. So we have the rational way of understanding that God is knowing. And then we have the revelatory precedent, the lexical precedent. The dictionary definition of knowing is that it means knowing, and God used the word knowing to mean knowing, so that's the lexical way of saying we can describe God as knowing. I mean, and both Ibn Furak can actually write sentences in Arabic that are incredibly circular in exactly that way. So, and what makes it easier, I think, for them to explain this in Arabic, in the Arabic conceptual vocabulary that they had and that they were using and that they were all familiar with and that we're not particularly familiar with these days, is that they had this word ma'ana that just occupied this conceptual space in exactly that triangle between God and God's revelation and our rational understanding of God and our rational reading of God's revelation and our recognition of the lexical precedent that God established in the Quran. Because ma'ana sits like in the middle of that triangle, and it exists in our minds, but ma'ana also exists with God, of course, because God speaks and the Quran has ma'ani, and so those ma'ani are God's, and they're what's being communicated to people. So ma'ana, it's not just that it's this human thing, it's also a divine thing. And God, of course, having created all human minds anyway, and being, according to the Asharis, constantly in control of everything that exists in the created world by this process of constant recreation and the human acquisition of acts. Ma'ana becomes both human reality and linguistic fact and divine reality all at the same time. And they don't need to kind of explain that with 3 different words like I just did, because their conceptual vocabulary just has a word that does that job. Like we in English have to make these divisions between epistemology and ontology, between a theory of knowing and a theory of being, between the 3 points of the triangle, like God, revelation, reason. But that's because we're using an English, Anglophone, European conceptual vocabulary that has these clear distinctions between epistemology and ontology, and they didn't. They could just talk about ma'ana, and their audience would understand how ma'ana fit into both the divine and the dictionary. Makes sense.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Lubna. I am a second-year Ph.D. student, so I'm getting really near that point of having to decide what I need to work on. And my question is about Jorjani's kind of his conceptualization of ma'ana and how that changed or how that impacted the way that that poetry was read at the time. I mean, he's kind of saying that how you say something matters, and this is at a time when the muhdithun are being really heavily debated. So did this have an effect on the reception of poetry at the time? Did it change the discourse? I mean, did it make it easier for other scholars to accept these modernist poets who are changing the way that poetry is being written or conceptualized?
Yeah, that's an excellent question and a very good observation. I hadn't actually thought about it in those terms, but I think if you think that muhdath poetry and Badi'a was controversial, Ibn al-Mu'taz wrote Kitab al-Badi'a, because this was a controversial idea that poetry was going to start doing these kinds of things. And I think you can. And Jorjani is a couple of hundred years after that. But I think that the literary critical methodology that people like Jorjani provided that explained how muhdath poetry and complex metaphor worked could well have contributed to the persistence of complex metaphor, for the next few hundred, for the next kind of 800 years or so, for sure. The broader question, what's interesting about the broader question between the literary criticism and the poetry is we tend to think of that criticism is in symbiosis with poetry. So poetry and criticism kind of go together and feed off each other. And this is true, and this is true in Arabic, just like it's true everywhere else. What's interesting about Arabic, about classical Arabic literary criticism, is that it's a very particular kind of criticism. It's very formal. It's very focused on syntax and grammar and structures of metaphor and cognitively mapping the structures of metaphor with this logical, grammatical account of syntax. It doesn't deal with, irony. Doesn't deal with power or all this. I mean, if you think of all the stuff that classical Arabic poetry talks about, power, irony, people die, meanings of, all the stuff that goes into what we would call in English the meaning of life. The poetry is dealing with all that stuff. But the criticism of Abdul Qahir al-Jorjani doesn't pick up on that. He's not interested in the irony of, Mutanabbi's, praising Kafur and then blaming him. He doesn't care about that. When he criticizes Mutanabbi in the literary critical sense, he's interested in how Mutanabbi constructed his metaphors. And that's it. It's formalist literary criticism. Where the meaning came in was in adab. You see the kind of literary critical reception of poetry that understands that what's going on is these plays about meaning and about power. That's how adab basically receives poetry. Adab is all about that irony and power and playing with these big ideas and fate and money and wealth and greed. So it's like the function of literary criticism as we understand it in the Anglophone European world today, in Arabic is split between, the meaning goes to adab and the formalist analysis goes to naqd al-shi'r, basically.
Can I take one more question from online? All right. Many linguists today argue that a comprehensive meaning is found in the syntax and not the word, similar to Jorjani. Others argue an utterance has no stable meaning at all, but rather a function or speech act. What do you think?
I kind of want to split the difference and agree with both. I really do think, having read all this stuff in Arabic and having, worked on the philosophy of language in English, Wittgenstein does seem to me to have the best explanation of human language. There are all these people who try and deal with human language in terms of pointing to stuff. Language basically replaces a physical gesture. You want to point at the pulpit, but you don't have any arms, so you use the word pulpit. The problem with that idea of language is it doesn't really explain the way that we use language all the time. And I think that Wittgenstein's idea that there's just nothing there, there's no set of meanings, there's no scales of imaginary dictionaries, there are no floating concepts, it's just word usage, and that's which explains how words can change their meaning so easily. If enough people pick up on it, and the person you're talking to knows what you're talking about, boom, it works. The meaning's changed, just like that. If you and I agree, after a few hours or a few days, that we're going to start calling the pews flyers. If we talk about it enough and we have a speech community and we play the language game, next week we can say, oh, I was sitting on a flyer in the auditorium, and we'll know that we were meaning the pew. And Wittgenstein's idea of how language works, I think, fits that best. When it comes to the syntax, when it comes to the, language only exists in syntactic form, and that's where the meaning comes from. There, I think, I agree with Jorjani. Jorjani's analysis of how language works in terms of syntax and his refusal to say that it's all about the words or it's all about the ideas, his absolute maintenance of, no, it's the words and ideas mixed together in syntax, according to lexical precedent, managed by reason, existing in actual sentences and clauses. That makes total sense to me. And I think, you can, you can see that same idea reappear in the 20th century in English, for sure. I don't think any of them read Jorjani, of course, but Jorjani certainly had that idea back in the 1000s.
There's another question online. Do you believe in a hierarchy of meaning? And is there an essential meaning that the hierarchy is floating around? How do you tackle Derrida's problem?
Yeah. I mean, it's a bit of a cop-out, but if I was to answer as Ibn Furak, I would say yes, and that hierarchy is defined by like a process of theology, by this tripartite process. There's lexical precedent, so Ash'ari is always saying things like, what's the ma'na of ilm? Well, the ma'na of ilm is that it's ma ya'lamu ma'lum. ما يعلم ما الذي يعلم ما يعلم العالم المعلوم. It's you just re-answer it in language. No, what's knowledge? Oh, it's the thing that the knower knows, basically. So that's answering it by the lexicon, or you answer it by reason, or you answer it by an account of it's what God put there. So he's absolutely committed to the idea that there's a hierarchy. And you can see, and that kind of same idea comes back when Jorjani talks about these bundles of ma'ani and about the kind of essences in them. So there's an idea of like hoarseness that's at the center of the bundle of ma'ani that make up the horse. And it's the kind of fact that there's a hierarchy within that bundle that enables poetry to kind of play with it. So if you pick some bit of the horse that's not central and you talk about that while still kind of assuming that your audience knows all the rest of the bundle of hoarseness. So it's like if you compare somebody to a lion, not by comparing them to a lion, but by comparing them to something with a mane, then you're referring to like a non-essential part of the lion, but by referring to the non-essential part of the lion, you're pulling the essential part of the lion in, so the metaphor works. So yeah, both Jorjani and Ibn Furak in slightly different ways have hierarchies of meaning. And yeah, and I would buy that. I mean, I think in a sense, I think the problem that Derrida has is that he's working in a French tradition that's dominated by Saussure. It's like with a completely different set of conceptual problems and a completely different set of things that he's responding to. It's like a different conversation. When Derrida complains about hierarchies of meaning, the target of his complaint isn't the hierarchies of meaning that Ibn Furak and Jorjani were setting out. He's like talking to people earlier than him in the French and European tradition. Yeah. That's the best answer.
Thank you. Please join me in expressing our thanks and gratitude for Professor Alexander Key, and This is the first lecture, but definitely when your book come out, we'll have you again. And it's going to be an open source book?
Yes.
So an open source book. So this means that you'll have access to it. This is a wonderful development to have as much access as possible. So thank you and wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.